Hash drowned in a horse trough by 3 drunken ranch hands. A cowboy shot all 3 and gave her breath back. The trough was oak. Somebody had built it wide and deep, built it to last, iron bands around the staves, and the water in it that night was cold enough to ache your teeth if you drank from it. I know because I did after. I dipped my hat and drank, and the cold went all the way down into my chest and sat there like a stone. But that was after. What I want to tell you about is the sound. You don't forget a sound like that. 3 men laughing. Laughing that particular way that drunk men laugh when they've decided they can do anything they want because there's nobody around to tell them no. That particular pitch, half giddy, half mean, that sound that lives somewhere between a whoop and a snarl. I've heard it a few times in my life, and every time I've heard it something bad was either happening or about to. I was coming around the back of the livery. My horse was stabled there, a buckskin named Contrary, which was accurate, and I'd gone to check on him because he'd been favoring his left foreleg since that afternoon, and I wanted to see if the swelling had come down any. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, somewhere in there. The town of Carver's Bend was quiet the way small towns get quiet at that hour, the way a place goes still when even the saloon has given up. And I heard that sound. I came around the corner of the livery, and the first thing I saw was the lantern somebody had hung on the post. The second thing I saw was the trough. The third thing I saw was her. They had her face down in it. 2 of them were holding her. One had her by the back of the neck with both hands, fingers dug in, and the other had her wrists crossed behind her back, and the third one was standing off to the side with his hat pushed back on his head, swaying a little, watching. Like it was entertainment, like it was something you watched. The 2 doing the holding were laughing that laugh. The one watching was grinning. I had my Colt out before I'd made a conscious decision to draw it. That's not something I'm proud of exactly. I mean, I'm not ashamed of it either. A man has things in him that move faster than thought, and if he's lived a certain kind of life, those things get honed to a particular edge. What I'm saying is it wasn't a choice I deliberated. My hand knew before my head did. I said, let her up. And I said it quiet. I found you don't need to shout. Something in a quiet voice when you're holding a gun carries its own weight. The 2 holding her looked up. The one watching looked over. They took in the gun and their faces went through a few things in quick order, surprise, then a kind of calculation, then something that settled into stupid bravado, the way drunk men's faces settle. The one watching said something I won't repeat, something about my business and where I ought to keep it. The one at her wrist said she owed them and they were collecting. The one at her neck didn't say anything. He just pushed her head down harder. And that was when I shot him. I shot him in the shoulder, not the center of him, because dead men make a different kind of trouble, and I wasn't looking for that trouble if I could help it. He went down sideways and made a sound like a man makes when his body is telling him something his brain hasn't caught up with yet. The woman came up out of the water. She came up gagging and fighting and clawing at the trough's edge. And the one at her wrists let go and took a step back, and I shot him in the calf, and he sat down hard in the dirt and started a different kind of hollering. The one who'd been watching had his hand on his gun by then. I don't know why he thought that was a reasonable thing to do, given the circumstances. I genuinely don't. But he did, and so I shot him, and I put that one lower than I meant to, grazed the outside of his thigh, and he went down too, and all 3 of them were down in the dirt making their various noises, and the woman was hanging off the edge of the trough, coughing water out of her lungs. I stood there. The gunshots had been loud the way gunshots are always loud when you're not expecting them, which I always am expecting them, I mean, and it seemed possible that someone in the town would hear, that a light would come on somewhere. None did for a good long while. Places like Carver's Bend, you learn to not hear certain things. I went to the woman. She was still holding the trough's edge with both hands, her fingers white around the wet wood, her head down, her hair hanging in strings. She was coughing with a deep rattling cough that told me she'd taken on some water. I put my gun away. I got hold of her arm, gentle, the way you'd handle something that might be frightened, and I said, come on, come away from there. She didn't fight me. She let me pull her back. Her legs weren't working right. They'd gone out from under her with the shock of it, and I had to mostly carry her to the wall of the livery and set her down with her back against it. She sat with her knees up and her hands flat on the ground, and she coughed and coughed until the coughing stopped, and then she just breathed, hard and deliberate. Like she was learning it again. I crouched in front of her. She was Apache. That registered in me and then it stopped registering, which is what I mean when I say I've lived a certain kind of life. Her dress was torn at the collar. There was a cut on her jaw. Her eyes, when she finally raised them, were black and steady, not grateful yet, not frightened, not anything particular. Just present, measuring. She said something in a language I didn't speak. I said, I don't know what that is. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said in English that was careful and precise, every word placed like a step on uncertain ground, "Why did you do that?" Not a question exactly. The way she said it, it wasn't a question, it was a request for information. Like she was trying to understand something that didn't fit the shape of things she already knew. I said, because they were drowning you. She kept looking at me. I said, is there somebody I should get for you? Somebody who'll know you? She looked past me at the three men in the dirt, who were still making noise, but a reduced kind of noise now. The noise of men who have been shot and are not dead, and are beginning to realize they are going to have to deal with what comes next. She looked back at me. She said, no. Just that, no. I said, all right. Her name was Issy. I learned that later, sitting at the livery in the lamplight while I cleaned and wrapped the wound on her jaw, which was deeper than I'd first thought and had bled into her hair and dried there. She sat still for it in a way that wasn't bravery, it was just stillness, a quality of not being bothered by the thing that was happening. I found out later she'd been bothered by worse, but that's later. I said, Issy. She said, it means dear. I said, is that what your people named you? She looked at me with those level eyes. She said, my people named me something else. That name is not for here. I understood that. I'd had a name once that I didn't use anymore either. Not the same thing, not even close, but I understood the principle of it. The idea that some names are for inside and some are for outside, and the outside world doesn't get everything. I said, I'm Cal. She said, I know what you are. I looked at her. She said, you are a man who has shot people before. It is in how you stand after. She wasn't wrong, I didn't say anything. She said, the one whose shoulder you hit. He works for Alderman Trace, you know this name. I did. Alderman Trace was a man who'd built himself a cattle operation the size of a small country on land that had been encouraged out of the hands of its prior occupants over the course of about a decade. Encouraged the way a bully encourages a smaller man off a bench, not by asking nicely. He owned a fair portion of Carver's Bend and a fair portion of the county north of it. His men were the kind of men a man like that keeps around. Men who have been given to understand that there's a certain amount of latitude available to them as long as they're useful. I said, that's going to be a problem. She said, yes. I said, for me or for you? She looked at me and said, both. I want to tell you something about what it's like to be the kind of man I was at that point in my life. I was 51 years old. I'd come up in Kansas, spent time in New Mexico, ridden for a few different outfits before the work dried up, and I'd found myself doing other things that I won't go into the particulars of, and then I'd stopped doing those things and started drifting, which is its own kind of thing. I wasn't wanted for anything significant. I'd kept clear of the law for the better part of 10 years. I had a horse, the clothes I wore, a bedroll, a colt I kept clean, and some money in my boot that wouldn't last me to the end of the month. That's not a complaint, that's a description. A man in that position gets very good at being invisible, at passing through, at having no connections, at never being in one place long enough to matter to anyone or to have anyone matter to him. You can live that way for a long time. The trick is not to notice it, and mostly I didn't. But there I was in the livery in Carver's Bend at 2 in the morning with an Apache woman sitting across from me while I cleaned a wound on her jaw. And there were 3 men in the dirt outside who worked for a powerful man, and something in me had already decided, already settled on the decision the way a hawk settles on a fence post, easy and definite, that I was not going to leave her here. I don't know what to call that. I didn't call it anything at the time, I just knew it. She was watching me, that level look, like she was reading something off my face that I wasn't saying out loud. She said, where will you go? I said, was thinking about that. She said, you cannot stay in this town. I said, I know it. She said, and neither can I. Long pause. The horse in the stall behind me, contrary, shifted his feet, blew a breath. Outside, one of the men on the ground had stopped making noise, which meant either he'd passed out or he'd gotten himself upright and gone for help, and neither one of those was good. I said, "You know this country." She looked at me like the answer to that was beneath answering. I said, "I don't. I'd be riding blind." She looked at me for a long time. I let her look. A man who's got something to hide doesn't like being looked at that way. I didn't have anything to hide from her, or if I did, it wasn't the kind of thing that mattered right now, and I think she could tell that. She said, "I know where to go." I said, "Then I'll follow your lead." Something moved in her face. Not much. She had a face that didn't give a lot away, but something moved in it, a fractional thing, a shift, and then it settled. She said, "We should go now." Contrary's leg was better. I'd been right about the swelling, it had come down, and he took my weight without complaint, which was unusual enough that I noted it. Issy had a horse in the livery too, a dun mare that nobody'd told her she couldn't stable there, and nobody'd said anything to her about it because the liveryman was a decent old man who'd seen enough in his life to know that a woman alone needs to be able to get out of a place fast. He told me about her that afternoon when I'd brought Contrary in. He'd said, "There's an Apache woman's mare in the third stall. I don't know her name and I don't want to. You leave that alone." I'd said, "None of my business." He'd looked at me and said, "No, it's not." Now I thought about that old man and I hoped Alderman Trace's men didn't hold him responsible for us leaving. I'd leave money for him. I left it in the mare's empty feed bucket, more than I could spare, and figured that was the only thing I could do. We went out the back of the livery. Issy on her mare, me on Contrary. No lantern. The town behind us dark and still. The land ahead of us a darkness of a different kind, bigger and quieter and full of things that I would need her to navigate and she wouldn't need me to navigate at all. We rode without talking for a while. I was all right with that. After a time she angled north, away from the road, and I followed. And the road disappeared behind us, and there was nothing around us but the flat and the dark and the enormous cold sky with the stars thick across it. I said quietly, not wanting to break anything, just needing to know, I said, "Are you all right?" She didn't answer for a moment. We rode. Then she said, "I am alive." I thought about that. I said, "That's the main thing." She said, "Yes." We rode. I should tell you what I knew about her situation, which was what I'd pieced together from the old liveryman that afternoon and from what she'd told me in the livery after. She'd been in Carver's Bend for 3 weeks. She'd come down from the north. She didn't say why, not then. And she'd been doing work where she could get it, which for a woman alone in a town like that meant laundry, mostly, and some work in the kitchen of the hotel that didn't pay much but kept her in food and a dry place to sleep. The 3 men from the Trough were Trace's hands. They'd decided over a few weeks of looking at her that she owed them something. The way that kind of man decides a thing like that, not with any logic you could argue against, because it's not logic, it's just appetite and the belief that appetite has a right to be satisfied. She'd been careful. She'd avoided them. She'd stayed visible when she could in public places during daylight. But 3 in the morning coming back from a late kitchen shift, and 3 of them, and the Trough was there, and her fighting had been why the one at her neck pushed down. She told me all of this very plainly, like she was giving testimony. Like she'd learned a long time ago that the way to handle a hard thing was to put words around it that were accurate and plain, to not let the hard thing get bigger than it was by giving it any decoration. I listened. I didn't say anything about it because there wasn't anything to say. The men who'd done it were alive, more or less. That was already more consideration than they deserved. And I had known since I'd first pulled her from the Trough that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. Not necessarily this specific thing, but the shape of it. The shape of being in a place where you have no one at your back and certain men know it. I knew the shape of that from a different angle, being the man with no one at his back. The land around us opened up as we rode. The flat gave way to a slow rise, and the rise to low hills, and the hills to a cut in the rock that she navigated without slowing down, like she'd ridden it before, and maybe she had. I followed. Contrary was steady, steadier than his name suggested, and I had enough moon to see by. She pulled up in a place that was sheltered on 3 sides by rock, a natural windbreak, and she got down and I got down, and we tied the horses to the scrub pine at the back of it. She said, "We can stop here until it's light." I said, "All right." I got my bedroll off Contrary and unrolled it and offered it to her. She looked at it. She said, "You'll be cold." I said, "I've been cold before." She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a blanket, heavy wool gray, fraying at one edge, and she threw it at me. Good throw, clean. She said, so have I. She took the bedroll. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and sat back against the rock, and she sat on the bedroll across from me and pulled her knees up under her, and that was how we spent the rest of that night, not sleeping, not talking much, just present in the dark together while the horses breathed and the stars moved slowly overhead. She didn't trust me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. She didn't trust me. She was a woman alone who'd nearly been drowned that night by men she'd also not trusted, and the fact that I'd stopped that didn't make me trustworthy. It just made me someone who'd done one useful thing. That's a different category. I understood the distinction. I'd have made it myself. But she didn't leave, either. As the sky started to gray in the east and the stars faded out one at a time and the hills around us took on shape and color, she sat on that bedroll and watched the light come, and she didn't leave, and I understood that there was a calculation being done. Not about me particularly, about what was available, about what the options were. A woman alone in a country that had stopped being safe for her a long time ago, running from 3 men who worked for a powerful rancher, no family she'd mentioned, no destination she'd told me yet. I was one of the variables in a problem she was working out. That was fine. I could be a variable. I could be useful. I'd spent a lot of my life being neither. When the light was full enough, she stood and she stretched and she went to her mare and began checking the mare's feet, one at a time, with a focus and competence that was good to watch. The way she ran her hands down the leg, the way she lifted the hoof and looked, the way she set it down. A person who knows horses, a person who takes care of what's hers. She said without looking up, "You know how to fight." I said some. She said, "You were not scared." I said, "I don't have a lot left to lose. That helps." She set the mare's last foot down and stood up and looked at me over the horse's back. Something in her face had shifted a little from the night before. Not warm, not yet, but something. She said, "Where you were going when you came to Carver's Bend." I said, "Nowhere in particular." She said, "You had no destination." I said, "That's right." She stood there thinking. The sun was just up, low and orange and throwing long shadows. The rock around us was pink with it. She said, "My sister's family is 3 days north, a place in the hills that Trace does not know about." That is where I was going before. I said, "Before?" She said, "Before they started watching me." I said, 3 days north on this country." She said, "I know the way." I said, "I believe you." Pause the horses, the morning. She said, "Trace will send men." I said, "More than 3 this time." She said, "Yes." I said, "Then it'd be better to make 3 days in 2. She looked at me. I said, "If that's an invitation." Very long pause. She picked up her blanket and folded it in a way that was precise and deliberate, and she strapped it to her mare and she mounted up. She sat there on the dun in the early light and she looked down at me. She said, "You would do this for a stranger." I said, "You're not exactly a stranger anymore." She thought about that. She looked out at the country to the north. Then she looked back at me, and there it was again, that fractional shift in her face, that thing that wasn't quite anything named yet but was starting to be. She said, "Then we should ride." But first, before any of that, before the riding and the country and the days, there was the moment just outside the livery when I understood what I'd stepped into. I'd gone back out to see about the 3 men. I needed to know if any of them were moving, if any of them had gone for help, what the situation was. The shoulder man was down against the trough, conscious but not going anywhere, his hand pressed to his shoulder and his face a particular gray color. The calf-shot one had dragged himself to the wall and was sitting with his leg out in front of him, making a low, steady sound. The third one, the one I'd grazed, was gone. He'd gotten up and walked. Which meant he was on his way somewhere. I went back in and told Issy, "Third man's gone. We need to move now, not in an hour." She was already standing. She'd heard something in my boots on the ground, the pace of them, and she'd already started getting her things together. She looked at me and nodded once. That was the first time I understood something about her, that she didn't waste time on things that were already done. The 3 men were handled. My shooting them was a decision already made, and she wasn't going to make me explain it or regret it or replay it. We had a problem that was moving, and we needed to move ourselves. I've known a lot of people who couldn't do that, who needed to sit with the last thing before they could move to the next thing. I understand it. I've been that way myself sometimes. But not her. She had that ability to put a line through what was finished and stand in what was current, and it was a quality I respected immediately and have respected in her every day since. We gathered what there was to gather, 5 minutes, maybe less. I need to tell you what 3 days of country looks like when you're riding it right. We went hard the first day. She set a pace that didn't waste anything, not speed, not terrain, not the horses. She read the land the way I read a hand of cards, instinctively and completely. And she took us along the bottoms of things where we'd be harder to spot from the high ground, and through the arroyos and dry washes where the ground was hard and wouldn't hold a track. And by midday, we'd covered more distance than I'd have covered in a day and a half riding alone. I just followed. Followed and watched and tried to be what was needed, which right then was a steady hand at her back and somebody who could shoot if it came to that. She ate small. She watered the horses at every opportunity, which was more often than I'd have found because she knew where the water was, small seeps and rock tanks, and one spring hidden under a limestone overhang that I would have ridden past without seeing. She slept light and short, sitting up with her head tipped against the rock, and she woke complete, no grogginess, no adjustment period. Eyes open and present. I slept a little less than that. The second morning she started talking to me. The second night was different from the first. We camped in a wash, low-walled, good cover, the horses tied short. She'd found water just before dark, a trickle off a rock shelf, barely enough but enough, and we'd watered the horses and filled what we could carry and made camp dry-mouthed and tired. I'd sat down to take off my boots and she'd said, without looking up from where she was checking the mare's feet, "Your shoulder." I said, "What about it?" She said, "You've been holding it since midday." I hadn't realized I was. I rolled it once and felt the familiar pull, old wound, a place where something had been broken and knit wrong years ago, and it ached in certain weather and after certain kinds of riding. I'd been compensating without thinking about it. I said, "Old thing, it's fine." She put the mare's foot down. She came and stood in front of me. She said, "Let me see." I said, "It's fine, truly." She said, "Cal." Just that, my name. Said the way a person says a name when they mean, "Stop arguing and let me help you." I let her look. She pressed along the shoulder with her fingers, two-handed, finding the place methodically. And when she found it, I felt it, and she saw me feel it, and she pressed there with a deliberate and sustained pressure that hurt sharply, and then, this is not something I can explain fully, released. Like something wound too tight given permission to unwind. She said, "I have seen this before. Men who ride hurt and don't say." I said, "Didn't seem like the time to mention it." She said, "There is always a time to mention it to me." I looked at her in the last of the light. She looked back at me. Her hands were still on my shoulder. I said, "All right." She stepped back. She didn't make a thing of it. She just went to her side of the fire, and I went to mine, and we went to sleep, or tried to, and my shoulder was considerably better for the rest of the ride. That was the second night. Not much, but some. Little pieces of information offered without explanation, the way you offer something to see how it's received. Her family's arrangement with the hills. What Trace had done to a band of families 4 years back, driving them off the water. How she'd learned English from a woman at a mission school, a woman who'd taught her to read and who hadn't been the kind of teacher who made you ashamed of what you were. She said that last part like she expected me to not understand why it mattered. I said, "That's a rare thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "The teaching or the not making you ashamed?" She said, "Both." She rode in silence for a while. Then she said, "You have been out here a long time." I said, "Long enough." She said, "You have no family." I said, "Not anymore, had some once." She waited to see if I'd say more. I didn't. She left it alone, which I appreciated. She was good at that, knowing when something had an edge and not pressing on the edge. She said, "The man at the trough, the shoulder man, he was the worst one." I said, "He's the one I shot first." She said, "You saw that?" I said, "He was the one doing the deciding." She looked over at me on that. The trail had widened enough that we could ride abreast for a stretch, and she was close enough that I could see the expression on her face, which was something I'd call assessment. She was looking at me the way you look at a thing when you're trying to understand how it works. She said, most men shoot the nearest one first. I said, most men shoot in a panic. She said, and you don't. I said, not often. She looked ahead again. The land was rising, getting rockier, the hills higher now, with some scrub oak coming in at the upper slopes, and the smell of the air different, cooler, with something green in it. She said, you are a hard man. I said, yeah. She said, it is not a bad thing, out here. I didn't say anything. She said, I have met hard men who enjoyed being hard, who were hard on purpose, who used it. I said, I know that kind. She said, you are not that. I rode, the horses were climbing now, and I felt Contrary's stride lengthen into the incline. I said, how can you tell? She said, you were very gentle with my face. I've carried that with me since. You were very gentle with my face. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. She wasn't giving me a compliment exactly. She was telling me something she'd observed, filing it under something. Under whatever category she was using to figure out what I was. And I thought about it, the way I'd cleaned that cut on her jaw. The way I'd held her face, tilted it into the lamplight, worked the cloth slow and careful, dried it before the bandage. It hadn't seemed like anything to me. It had seemed like the obvious way to do it. You don't hurt someone who's already been hurt. You don't add to a thing like that. It seemed obvious. But she'd noticed it. And the noticing, her noticing, was something I didn't know what to do with. I'd been invisible for a long time. Not in the sorry way, not in the pitying way, but in the practical way. The way of a man who doesn't expect to matter to anyone and has arranged himself accordingly. And here was a woman who saw things, who saw me specifically, and was filing what she saw under something that wasn't threat or usefulness but something else. I didn't know what to do with that. So I rode. We made it in 2 days, and an early morning, like I'd said. The third night we camped at the base of a long hill, and she pointed at the top of it and said, there. We couldn't see anything from where we were, but I understood that wasn't the point. The point was that she could feel it. I made a fire, small and smokeless, dry wood, which she'd chosen, and we ate what I had, which was some dried meat and hardtack that she improved considerably by producing from her bag some dried berries and a small cake of something pressed and sweet that I didn't ask about and she didn't explain. We ate. The fire made its small light. She said, tell me something about yourself. I said, what do you want to know? She said, anything. Something true. I sat with that for a moment. The fire popped. Contrary and the Dun were close together in the dark behind us, their breathing slow and synced the way horses' breathing gets when they've traveled together long enough to trust each other. I said, I used to have a son. She went still. I said, he died. 7 years ago, fever, he was 9. I hadn't said that out loud in 7 years. I don't know what made me say it then. Maybe it was the dark. Maybe it was her asking for something true. Maybe it was just 7 years and the weight of it finally needing to go somewhere outside of me. She sat with it. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, what was his name? I said, Thomas. She said, Thomas. She said it quietly, like she was putting it somewhere safe. Then she said, I lost a daughter. 2 years ago, she was 4. We sat with both of those things together in the dark. There wasn't anything to say about them. There never is. But sitting with them together was different than sitting with mine alone, and I think she understood that because she'd sat with hers alone, too. After a while she said, the world is very hard. I said, yeah. She said, and still here we are. She said it like it was a thing that required noting. Like the fact of still being here was worth observing, not sadly but plainly, look at this, look at us, still here on this hill with the stars overhead and the horses breathing. I said, still here. And something in me, something that had been standing back from everything for a very long time, standing back and watching from a distance and declining to come closer, something shifted. The way ground shifts in a thaw, slow and deep and not reversible. I didn't say anything about it. I fed another small piece of wood into the fire and watched it catch. Her sister's name was Loma, and she had a husband named Gideon who was Chiricahua, and a man of great dignity and physical largeness who shook my hand with a grip that I respected, and gave me a look that told me he'd been informed already. By whom? Issy hadn't been out of my sight, but the look told me the information had been verified and found satisfactory. and their 3 children looked at me with the frank, unblinking curiosity that children have, no fear in it, just interest. The family had a place in a fold of the hills that was invisible from below, a set of structures built low and smart, built by people who understood that the best protection is to not be seen. There was water and there were horses, and there were signs of long occupation, of a life built carefully and tended. Loma was smaller than Issy and had her sister's eyes and was fiercely and immediately practical. She assessed me in about 8 seconds, took my horse without asking, handed me a bowl of something that smelled like heaven after 2 days of hardtack and said, "You'll stay." It wasn't a question. I said, "For a while if that's all right." Loma looked at Issy. Something passed between them that I wasn't meant to read. Loma said, "For a while." Trace's men came on the 4th day. 4 of them, they came up the main trail, the visible one, the one that didn't go where we were. Gideon tracked them from a high point for most of the morning and came back and told us they'd turned around at the base of the hills. They didn't know where to look. The place was good that way. When Gideon told us they'd turned back, he looked at me and said, "You stayed." I said, "Didn't seem like the time to leave." He said, "No." Issy was sitting at the table in the house. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me with that level look, and there was something in it that I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had and hadn't named it yet. Something that was close to relief but not soft. Something more like I was right, not about me specifically, about the calculation she'd been doing since the livery, about what she decided to risk by bringing me here. I held that look for a moment, and then I went and checked on Contrary. You do the thing, you don't make a speech about it. I stayed, and in those 2 days I worked. There was always something to work at, a fence post that needed resetting, a saddle that needed stitching, water to carry, wood to split. Gideon accepted my work without comment and without excessive gratitude, which was the right way. He was a man who didn't need to make a speech about a thing. You did what needed doing, he noticed it, that was the exchange. The second evening he sat down beside me at the fire outside and said, "You ride well." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Issy says you shoot better than you ride." I said, "That's probably true." He looked at the fire. He said, "She doesn't say things she doesn't mean." I said, "I know that." Long pause. One of the children, the oldest boy, maybe 8 years old, a serious child with his father's bearing already forming in him, came out of the house and looked at us from the doorway, and Gideon said something to him quietly in his language, and the boy went back inside. Gideon said, "She has had a hard few years." I said, "I know some of it." He said, "Not all." I said, "No." He poked the fire with a stick, and the sparks went up. He said, "She came down out of the north in the spring. She had been alone since the winter before. She does not say everything about that time." I sat with that. He said, "She is not." He stopped. He tried a different way. He said, "She has been careful since then. She watches everything. She doesn't decide fast." I said, "I know." He said, "The fact that she brought you here." He left it. I said, "I understand." He looked at me, that steady look, the look of a man deciding. Then he nodded once and stood up and went inside. I sat at that fire for a while after. The night was cold and the stars were hard and bright. Inside the house there were voices, low ones and then quiet. That was how I knew I was going to stay. We were by the horses. She was brushing down the dun, and she went on brushing for a moment after I'd said it, her strokes slow and even. Then she stopped. She said, "Where?" I said, "Don't know yet." She said, "That same answer." I said, "Same answer." She put down the brush. She turned around and she stood with her back against the dun's shoulder, and she looked at me. She said, "You should stay." I said, "I brought trouble with me, Trace's men." She said, "Trace's men have gone. Gideon says they'll not be back." I said, "I can't be sure of that." She said, "You can't be sure of anything. That is true everywhere you go." I stood there. She said, "There is work here. Gideon needs another hand, the cattle need." I said, "Issy." She stopped. I said, "If I stay, it's not going to be for the work." Long silence. The dun moved and she moved with it, comfortable, the horse shifting its weight and she shifting hers. The morning was very clear, the light clean and direct. She said, "I know that." I said, "I just need you to know that I know that." She looked at me for a long time, And then she did something I wasn't expecting. She crossed the space between us 4 steps, unhurried, and she put her hand flat on my chest. Not a hug, not an embrace. Just her hand, flat and warm, right over my heart. She said, "I was waiting to see if you would say it." I said, "Were you?" She said, "Yes. I have been watching you for 2 days, and a morning trying to decide to say it." I said, "What decided you?" She said, "You went back for Gideon's bay horse when she pulled her picket line this morning. You were gone an hour. You did not mention it." I looked at her. She said, "You do not make a show of what you do. You just do it." I said, "That's a small thing." She said, "No, it is not." Her hand pressed a little. "It is not a small thing at all. I want to tell you about the morning a week later when I came in from checking the north fence line. It was about a 4-hour ride out and back, cold work. The sky throwing sleet sideways. And I came back in half frozen, and she came out of the house, and she looked at me once. The same way she'd always looked at me, level and complete. And without a word she went back inside and came back out with a blanket and a cup of something hot, and she handed them to me and stood there while I drank it. That was all. That was all, and it was everything. Because what it meant was that she'd expected me back. She'd built the expecting into her day. She'd known when I'd be back, and she'd had the cup ready, and she'd come out when she heard contrary in the yard, and none of that was the big gesture. None of it was the declaration. But it was the thing that lands hardest when you've spent a long time being no one's expected. When you've been in the world as a man who could disappear and no one would mark the gap. She handed me that cup and she stood there and looked at me, and I felt the weight of being expected return to me like something I hadn't known I'd lost. I drank the cup down, she took it back. I said, "That's good." She said, "It is the same thing I make every time." I said, "It's good every time." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Go see to your horse, then come eat." I went to see to my horse. Contrary got his name because he'd been a difficult animal his whole life, prone to biting, to shying, to doing the opposite of whatever was asked. But he'd been mine for 6 years, and we'd come to a kind of understanding, the way you come to an understanding with anything you spend 6 years with. He knew my weight. He knew my moods, or something like moods. He'd favored that left foreleg in Carver's Bend, and it had cost me a night, and that night had led me around the back of the livery, and the rest of it follows. I thought about that sometimes, about the leg, about the small turns that carry you into the big things. I thought about the woman at the mission school who'd taught Issy to read, and had not made her ashamed. A woman whose name I didn't know and would never know, who'd done one right thing and couldn't have known what would follow from it. Issy knowing English. Issy telling me where to go. The 3 days becoming 2, all of it. You can't trace a life back to its source, but you can sometimes trace it back to a few specific points. The trough, the lantern, the sound of a man laughing that particular way. And look at those points and understand that they were real and that they mattered and that you were present in them, which is all you can really ask. In the fall, Gideon built onto the main house. An extra room, 2 more stalls for the horses. Loma's children helped carry the timber and were underfoot the entire time with a helpfulness that slowed the project by approximately 30% and made it considerably better. I built the west wall. I'm not a man with many skills, but I can build a wall. I know where to put the weight. Issy came and stood in the doorway of the new room when it was finished, and she looked at it, and she nodded slowly, the way she assessed everything, thoroughly and without hurry. She said, "It's solid." I said, "Should be. I built it to last." She looked at me over her shoulder. She said, "I know. There's a thing she does. When she's thinking hard about something, working something out in her mind, she goes very still. Everything stops. And then when she's decided, her whole face changes, not by much, not dramatically, nothing dramatic about her, but something settles in it. Some tightness goes out. I learned to recognize that face, the face after the settling. The first time I understood what it meant was the morning she came and stood in front of me at the corral and looked at me with that settled face and said, "I want you to know something." I said, "All right." She said, "I did not think I would find this again, what I am finding." She said it plainly. She said it the way she said everything, plainly and without decoration, every word placed like a step. I didn't say anything for a moment. The horses in the corral moved around us. The morning was cold and clear. I said, "Neither did I, asterisk." She reached out and she took my hand, both of hers around one of mine. My hand is a big rough hand, scarred at the knuckles, not a hand you'd call gentle to look at. She held it like it was something worth holding. She said, "You are a good man." I said, "You don't have to say that." She said, "I know I don't have to. I am saying it because it is true and because I am choosing to." She looked up at me. She said, "You were very good with my face, and with the horse, and with Loma's children, and with Gideon, and with me." She squeezed my hand. "You do not make a show, you just do." I looked at her. She said, "I am glad you came around that livery." The morning was bright. Everything was very clear. The hills, the sky, the horses in the corral, her face looking up at me. The slant of the early light. I said, "So am I. I think about the trough sometimes. The oak of it, the iron bands, the cold of the water when I dipped my hat and drank from it after the way the cold went down into my chest and sat there. I think about her hands on the edge of it, white-knuckled and gripping, the way she came up out of it, the particular fight and how she came up not graceful, not anything like graceful, but absolute, the body insisting on its right to breathe. She gave herself her breath back, if I'm being precise about it. I got the men off her. The breathing was hers. That's how she is. She does the main thing herself. She just needed the space to do it. And I was the man with the gun and the absence of fear who could clear that space. And she was the woman who knew what to do with it. That was what we were from the beginning. I didn't know it at the beginning. But looking back from here, from this morning, from the fall light on the hills and the horses in the corral and the smell of something cooking in the house, from here I can see it. What we each brought. What fit. She needed a man who could clear a space and hold a line. I needed a woman who would see what I was and name it true and not look away. Both of us had been waiting a long time. Neither of us said it like that. We didn't need to. She knows what she is to me. I know what I am to her. Out here in the hills. In the house we're building, a room at a time, solid enough to last. Still here. And